Good afternoon to you all. We're very glad to have here Professor Bianca Premo. It's a pleasure to us to have Professor Bianca Premo here during the last section of our international seminar, in Permanent Seminar on Legal History at the Federal University of Ceará. This seminar is organized by the research group, a coordinate, Núcleo de Estudos sobre Direito na América Portuguesa. This is a seminar that started in 2 years ago. It is I guess, the third year we are doing this kind of activity, and it's an honor to have the authors we read here, and one of these authors is Professor Bianca Premo. I'm gonna present very quickly Professor Bianca Premo. She's a professor of history at the Florida International University. She was previously a professor at the Emory University. She got a PhD in history at the University of North Carolina. She's the author of many articles and books that contributed a lot with legal history during the early modern age, particularly on Latin America and Spanish America. I can mention two books: Children of the Father King, Youth, Authority, and Legal Minority in Colonial Lima, published in 2005, and particularly her last book, The Enlightenment on Trial, Ordinary Litigants and Colonialism in the Spanish Empire, published by the Oxford University Press. I have to say, Bianca, that this book was read here by our students in the seminars I coordinate at the PhD program in law at the Federal University of Ceará, and this book it's one of the most important books on this topic, and one of the books that have more influence on my work. I always say, and my students can testify what I'm saying here. Names like you, Renzo Honores, Michelle McKinley, Tamar Hessol, Yana Yanakakis are one of our great influences on the studies of the history of the litigants in Spanish America. But as we don't have a similar works in Portuguese America, we use a lot your works. And among the papers, I have to mention one published 2 years ago in 2019, named A Court of Sticks and Branches, Indian Jurisdiction in Colonial Southern Mexico and Beyond, with Yana Yanakakis. It's I'm gonna I'm gonna talk a little bit about this paper afterwards. And I have to mention also probably the only text by Professor Bianca that was published in Portuguese, named title is Como se fosse minha, Amor e Direito na Sociedade Escravocrata de Lima, Peru, no século XVIII. This text was published in a book organized by my dear friend Carmen Alvear and Tiago Dias. It was a conference I attended to 3 years ago in 2018 during the event of the AIC, International Meeting of Colonial History in Natal. Bianca, thank you so much. We are very honored to have you here. I thank you also for the audience here. We have a very a highly qualified audience, and you have the time you wish, and then feel free. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for the invitation, Gustavo. I am equally a fan of your work. I feel that we have dialogues and similar interests. So it's a pleasure to be here and to be able to talk with you. I'm going to talk obviously in English. If anybody prefers to ask questions in Portuguese, I can usually understand. I'll answer probably back in Spanish. But out of respect for being in Brazil right now. I'm going to give a short summary of my paper in Portuguese, just in case it helps orient anyone to the talk, which is written, so it can sometimes get a little bit cumbersome. Minha apresentação hoje se concentra neste Tribunal Executivo, o Juzgado General de Naturais. É tribunal especial para súditos indígenas, localizado no Palácio do Vice-Reino, conhecido na historiografia como o Tribunal do Meio Real. Establecido no 500 y durando até o final do domínio espanhol, o Juzgado General de Naturales foi elemento fixo do governo colonial e de justiça, permitindo que os súditos indígenas encaminhassem suas queixas jurídicas diretamente ao vice-rei, sem ter que passar pelas rigorosas formalidades civis regulares. Minha apresentação começa e termina com motim na cidade do México de 1792, o que dividiu cronologicamente o período do domínio espanhol. Okay. And I have a PowerPoint, and we can kind of begin with it, but I wanted to also just signal, as Gustavo really took care of, but where this paper or this project fits in to what I've been doing or what you might have read. So if Gustavo, if you don't mind showing the first slide. And I'll talk because it's not, the first slide is not, it's just got the covers of the very books that Gustavo mentioned, right? These 2 books that I wrote. But also, this very first image is from Law and History Review. So I'm moving this paper toward publication in the Law and History Review. But right now, it exists on the website. And as you can see, this is several different authors are together in a workshop around the everyday materials of colonial legal spaces. So this is kind of a project that I'm working on that has to do with the materiality of law, right? And as you can see, Yana Yanakakis, who is my partner in crime, is there. We're not working co-authoring on this one, but she's a good friend and a collaborator. And so I'm happy to talk about the article that we wrote together, Indigenous Law, what I know of her work, and channel her and the work that I have done on Indigenous law. But this particular paper today is really pursuing a couple different things that came up from my prior research. First, I'm very interested in law, when we look at law and in the everyday life of litigation, all the way down to the question of who wrote on the papers that we find in the archive, how they were constructed, and how much agency or authorship we can ascribe to ordinary people. And that includes ordinary people, enslaved people, indigenous commoners, ordinary women. How much agency, how much legal knowledge, how much acumen and skill in the law can we ascribe to them? And some of this question, I just changed my window. There, I'm back. Some of this question came from my first book, which was about children and legal minority in colonial Lima. Now, children, obviously, especially small children, if 10 months old, all the way up to 10 years old, don't really tend to write historical records. But they were really present in the archives. They kind of overflow in the archives because they're being represented. And so this question, the history of childhood really distills and centers around these questions of agency and historical authorship. And, there's a relationship between what I found in terms of change over time, and especially the end of the 18th century, in Children of the Father King. And I pursued those questions for the Enlightenment on trial. But in that book, I continued to pay a lot of attention to the everyday interactions around writing that made up the lawsuits that we now find in the archive. And in that book, I was very interested in the growth of civil cases at the end of the 18th century in Spanish America, a growth, an increase that is absent in Spain, in the metropolitan areas, especially an area called the Montes de Toledo, as well as the High Court of Valladolid. So those were my first two books and kind of how they fit in. But in doing research for the Enlightenment on trial, I became interested in jurisdiction, in whether or not what I saw in civil cases could represent legal activity. What were jurisdictional debates? Were things just moving from church courts to royal courts, right? In this process of secularization, which doesn't, of course, mean that people were becoming less religious personally or theologically, but in the secularization of law. And in the competition between royal and ecclesiastical authorities. And in the research around jurisdiction, I ended up really focusing a lot on this famed court, the Juzgado General de los Naturales. And I really became interested in how we hear that term, or at least I did, and we imagine a court, a whole institution, maybe even a building, right? A court and a judge and the apparatus. But when you really look at the Juzgado, it was actually more of a channel, like a via, in which different actors, the audiencia and the oidores of Nueva España, or the virrey of Nueva España, actually kind of shared authority and channeled indigenous litigants in certain places. I'll talk about this a little bit more, but the materiality, of going to the Juzgado de Naturales, right, is really the question that I was fixated on. What was it like as an indigenous litigant? And so that's the setup for this paper about the half real. So if we can go to the next slide, Gustavo, together. So now I'll start the formal paper. An indigenous litigant might have traveled for days to have an audience with the viceroy at the special Indian court, the Juzgado de Naturales. Once the litigant arrived in the bustling, huge capital of Mexico City, which had 60,000 people at the beginning of the 18th century and probably above 120,000 by the end of the 18th century. And, comparatively, that's a pretty big city for the period. This legal pilgrim that we imagine would cut across orderly grid-like streets into the city center, where elites had fixated on the unruly presence of indigenous residents and had launched from the beginning of the colonial period ceaseless segregation campaigns. With no friends or acquaintances in the city, which, most indigenous litigants probably would have had some networks, but let's imagine that this one doesn't. The traveler might lodge in the Real Hospital de San José de los Naturales, which doubled as a hospital and an inn. The hospital had been founded on a royal tax that was levied only on indigenous men in the amount of a half real. A half real was about 1/16 of a peso, like we know, of a peso de ocho. And that was actually the same amount that was levied annually also on indigenous men in the Viceroyalty of New Spain to support the personnel and the functioning of this special court, the Juzgado de Naturales. Okay, so let's look at the next slide together. So let's imagine the petitioner staying at the Real Hospital de San Jose and entering the Zócalo, or the main plaza, from the west, just like in this painting from Villalpando, this famous painting of the Zócalo of Mexico City, at the beginning of probably at the beginning of the 18th century. There, they would have passed by this famous market known as the Parian, and then entered what is really an exceptionally large plaza. If you've ever been to Mexico City, it's very kind of imposing and laid out and wide, walking over the rubble of the great Aztec temple, which was kind of up over in the direction, I don't know if you can see me, but there. So we're looking at the cathedral on the left of the screen, and then right in front of us is this long, rectangular, hulking, low structure, which was the palace. Now, you can see in this, there's something going on the right side of the palace, and that is that it's half crumbled. It had been torched, set on fire in June of 1692 by rioters who were protesting high grain prices, particularly maize, as well as official corruption. This uprising really actually was composed of a broad cross-section of Mexico City's population, but it was very quickly known as and characterized as an Indian riot. So I want to talk today about the Special Executive Court for Indigenous Subjects, which was ostensibly located inside the palace, right? Like it's a real physical place. And it's known as the Juzgado de Naturales, or alternately as the Court of the Medio Real, right? For the amount of tax that was paid to maintain it. It was established in 1592, and it lasted all the way to the end of the 18th century, known as a fixture of colonial governance and justice, which permitted indigenous subjects to kind of bypass regular jurisdictions and appeal directly to the viceroy without going through these exacting formalities of regular procedure, right? Using the riot at the beginning and the end of the talk is intended to kind of show how the riot bisected colonial rule really in two pieces. And I have the trajectory for the first part really well stretched out or sketched out in the talk. I have some observations I need to integrate into the paper that maybe you'll be interested to help me with about some changes in the 18th century. Surprisingly, in this paper, I'm much more interested in the 16th century than in the 18th century, even though the 18th century clearly attracts me. I'm compelled and magnetized by the 18th century most of the time. So what this paper tends to do is, even though I'm not really looking at indigenous subjects' voices or perceptions, they're difficult to come by, I actually want to focus on that fact and argue that the Juzgado was as much a space of absence and abstraction as of pomp, procedure, and presence. So this is the central dynamic, or the central distinction that I'm going to make, that the Juzgado in some ways was imaginary, right? The Juzgado General de Naturales has long been treated in the historiography on law as a uniquely Spanish colonial legal institution. It's an embodiment of the way that Catholic medieval laws on personas miserables, miserable, los miserables, were retrofitted, taken from the Middle Ages and retrofitted to create special legal protections for conquered native inhabitants of the Americas after conquest. Their petitions as personas miserables were to be treated by going an express route to royal favor. They were technically to be gratis, summary, and frequently presided over by executive ruling, either fiat or by a kind of function in justice that the viceroy had to summarily solve disputes. In the latter instance, so when this was an executive action in solving matters of justice, which really constituted an enormous part of the Juzgado, the business of indigenous litigants would be presided over by the viceroy himself. Now, you know, the Juzgado grew over time and became more complex, and the viceroy channeled many disputes that were still technically in the Juzgado to the Audiencia for overseeing in a more traditional way, where partes would be notified and you would have the back and forth of a regular civil case, right? Or even criminal. There's a criminal jurisdiction. But the viceroy held on to a certain executive sphere. And many of the cases that you see, the so-called cases, actually are just summary decisions that are signed off on by the viceroy. And it's this aspect that most interests me. The viceroy, of course, is the king's living image in New Spain and the American dominions. And so it's this very personal interaction of approaching the viceroy in his judicial executive capacity that intrigues me. Because I think in administering justice in this administrative function, the viceroy carved out his special, really superiority at times over the audiencia and certainly over district judges, right? Always kind of hovering above them and having a certain amount of jurisdictional superiority. So my aim is to explore the implications and limitations of imagining that the viceregal audiences that comprised so much of the functioning of the Juzgado General de Naturales actually took place, as if they kind of occurred in a place. The executive actions of the viceroy, even when they funneled litigants to the audiencia, have been imagined as a spatial magnet, right? Drawing inhabitants from the diverse corners of Mexico to the capital and kind of centralizing power in the king's living image. This is to say that the Juzgado Naturales de Naturales has been imagined as a space of encounter in which native subjects sought justice almost in person from the viceroy as a judge. Now, recent attention in the field of Spanish American legal history or history overall has settled on legal writers, including notaries, scribes, procuradores, and agentes, this other kind of looser realm of writers that I talk about in a book, revealing the composite or polyphonic, as Renzo would call them, polyphonic or delegated nature of all of the papers of law. So rather than simple top-down impositions on litigants in which they were spoken for, or spaces of punitive spaces involving courtrooms and hearings, protocols and wigs, we've learned that a lot of law took place somewhat informally through the circulation of texts and through the imagined proximity to royal justice, measured in what historian Sylvia Sellers Garcia has called the space-time intervals that documents traveled, right? Thinking about how documents moved over space and arrived at a place like the Juzgado de Naturales. As I mentioned, one strain of my own research focuses on the production of these legal texts, on the prehistory of writing petitions, what happens before someone decides to have things written down, and deciphering who exactly was doing the writing. Much of the composition of lawsuits also took place not in the halls of justice, not even with the notaries that were official, but in the back alley drinking establishments, right? Pulquerias, pulperias, chicherias, in the houses or stalls of writers for hire, right? In, petate covered little stalls that would be set up right here in the center of the Zócalo, or far away from the courts in rural regions, where papers would be folded into little squares and sent off for, muleback journeys that would go on over days. But nonetheless, the language of legal documents, including petitions to the viceroy, always sounded like they read like their personal exchanges, and they invoke physical presence, casting petitioners as if they appeared and said things before judges and magistrates. So, parezco y digo, right? I appear and I say, or ante vuestra majestad, right? Like these are very concrete terms. And there's also the terminology of judges who saw these petitioners or petitions, and not only required the recorded response, but also the appearance of opposing parties. So parecer, ocurrir ante mí, right? And of course, daily hearings before very real magistrates who sat on elevated stages called estrados, in courtrooms that were adorned with tapestries, ticking clocks, and very watchful patron saints, took place most days of the year in different places of the empire, including in the palace. So it seems worthwhile to look at this balance and put flesh on colonial law, not only by attending to its vernacular or local or individual creation on paper, away from centers of colonial power, but doing more spotlighting on the indigenous experience with maximum Spanish authority in the New World, right at its heart, right in the palace, and right with the viceroy. And what this means is that we have to grapple with something, which is that it's very difficult to get a picture of how necessary it was to physically appear before the viceroy. Like it's just exceedingly difficult to get any images of doing the law, especially in the special Indian court. The term spaces of law, right? Espacios de derecho is invoked. If you do a search, you're going to find millions and millions, thousands of articles and books. But it's actually very metaphorical when you look at it. When most scholars are talking very metaphorically about law as space. And it's really difficult to discern how they're constituted in general. I hasten to say, though, that this haziness or slipperiness is not a historiographic failing in terms of the Juzgado de Naturales. Woodrow Borah wrote a landmark 1983 book on the Juzgado that goes over the procedures and personnel of the court in exquisite detail, right? Like he's done so much of the legwork that one could want. On the functioning of the Juzgado and its evolution over time. But my point is kind of beyond even that. It's to say that it's difficult to gain a sense of who appeared before whom in this jurisdiction, not because we haven't investigated it, but precisely because it was at once half real, half real, right? Medio real and hyper real. And I'll explain more what I mean by that. So looking inside the palace for the physical and material encounters around the Juzgado extends the medio real metaphor into something more poetic, which is to point to this place of proxies, disappearances, and absences. Okay, so long introduction, and now the heart of the thing. So if we'll go to the next slide. So probably, yeah, there we go. So before the creation of the court, the first viceroy of Mexico, Antonio de Mendoza, had emphasized the importance of receiving native petitioners directly in person and right in the palace. His physical proximity to gathering indigenous petitioners was close enough that he warned his successor of the stench and heat that they gave off when they met with him. But he persisted in having audiences with large contingents of petitioners because he believed and he expressed that his personal engagement in dispute settlement increased Spanish legitimacy. So here in the 1564 Codex Osuna, which is a native depiction portraying the exploitation, in fact, of indigenous labor, the focus of this codex is on the work being performed and its remuneration at the bottom. but we can grasp something here about physical proximity and meetings between the first Viceroy, Luis de Velasco, and at his Tecpancay, which is the Lord Palace House of that was established in the Zocalo, a Nahuatl rendering of the first house of viceregal authority that makes the Velasco's power one that looks like it comes through lineage. And this is something that Yana and I wrote about in our article, that there is this overlap between jurisdiction and the concept of the republicas as indigenous people in central Mexico came to understand jurisdiction, and the physical space of a kind of palace or court, as well as which also architecturally embodied or housed the lineage of the ruler or the judge. So in this case, the signaling about lineage turned out to be prophetic on the part of indigenous people, because Velasco's son, who succeeded him 30 years later as viceroy, became the legal architect of the Juzgado as a unique court for special oversight of Native complaints. So if we could go to the next slide. And here we have the Velasco II, right, the second. As the court began its formal functioning in 1592, the Juzgado attracted streams of petitioners. Many filed duplicate copies of papers that were related to civil litigation simultaneously before the viceroy and the audiencia, proliferating the number of papers and authority that was accruing to the palace. So others came specifically to the viceroy, it needs to be said, looking for licenses and acts of grace, and still others for writs of amparo, which were these executive summary rulings that would assist them with conflicts taking place at jurisdictions closer to their pueblos. It's important to note that the clean lines between litigations and petitions for amparo to the viceroy were really murky at this stage and kind of remained blurry from the bottom up over time, even as the Juzgado became more bureaucratized. Quickly, New Spain's viceroys realized that the expansion of their authority over native cases and their muscling out of lower-level magistrates meant, in the words of one, acting as an ordinary judge. And I think we have another viceroy. If you'll go to the next slide, we can look at Mendoza, I believe. Is he our next? Yeah. Velasco's successors continued to more rigidly formalize the court's personnel structure, repeatedly attempting to actually limit personal, if not paper, access to their viceroyal persons. Several of these viceroys even tried to restrict the number of petitioners who could come into the court in groups to no more than 2 representatives from any one pueblo. This was a move in Mexico that was mirroring similar initiatives undertaken by Francisco de Toledo, who was Peru's 5th viceroy, who was also trying to root indigenous people more to their pueblos and limit their movement over space into the viceregal court of Lima. The idea here was that the movement of indigenous populations in search of justice had to be fettered and indigenous people fixed in place. And we can see that also repeated in these segregation campaigns in Mexico City to root indigenous inhabitants in place. When the Conde de Monterrey fine-tuned the functioning of the court at the turn of the 17th century, he fretted in a letter to the crown about Indians streaming into the city so far away from their land, and he detailed a series of gatekeeping measures. Not only did he aim to fix native petitioners in their pueblos, but more pointedly, he signaled his own disappearance from the court. Showing up in person for the business of the Juzgado had, he claimed, diminished the dignity of his office. Receiving petitioners in person had resulted in, here I'll quote, in alguna quiebra que resultaba en el decoro de un lugar teniente de vuestra majestad, por verle hacer audiencias públicas como a un juez ordinario y sobre causas de muy poca importancia, proveyendo peticiones y substanciando pleitos a mi vista de mucha gente, así de calidad como ordinaria, notando cada uno a lo que le parecía. So he's saying here, they're just coming, all kinds of ordinary petitioners, they're taking away what they want, and I'm losing control of my image. The Viceroy's partial retreat from public audiences with indigenous petitioners in the Juzgado system tracked, in fact, with larger imperial disappearances of the Spanish king from courtly ceremonies during the reign of Felipe II in Madrid. The king was not, of course, gone forever. Subsequent monarchs varied their ritual ideologies, kind of playing peekaboo, sconchi, one of the things that I know, with their petitioners, right? Over time and throughout the centuries. But it is worth comparing what the Conde de Monterrey says about the diminution of his own, the mystique of his own appearance before indigenous petitioners, and an exchange between La Ciudad de Mexico and Madrid over a half century later, at the end of the 17th century, when a viceroy inquired about where they should place the main altar in the cathedral, which was being finished at that time. The response from the crown was kind of philosophical, pairing royal and sacred power and saying, in the palaces of princes, the Lord should not be seen from the door, for respect increases the greater the diligence required in seeking him. Over time, then, the executive legal process at the Juzgado de Naturales followed the same logic. The Conde de Monterrey displaced much in-person business with indigenous petitioners from the official salas or even antechambers and offices, and shifting his engagement to his private residences, where kind of a part on the northern end of the palace. Those chambers were later described by observers as being highly restricted in access. So there was this growing remoteness of the viceroy that fit in with a colonial political ideology that began to substitute, I would argue, royal favor for legal bureaucracy and access to the physical royal person of the viceroy for expertise in navigating the labyrinthine halls and bureaus of the palace and its legal offices. And this conforms to what Woodrow Borah says, which is by the 18th century, as the movement of papers took over in increasing measure, presentation of the petition became more a matter of filing by an agent and an absence of the plaintiff's presence. The meetings with these viceroys shrunk to being only in unusual circumstances. And this was true, I would say, even with meetings with the viceroy's asesor or legal advisor. We might not be that surprised that the viceroy wouldn't continue to meet with indigenous petitioners. But one of the things that I tracked over time is that the asesor, who had been established and continued to function from the time of the Conde de Monterrey on, he too kind of disappeared from meetings or physical presence with indigenous litigants or petitioners over time. And you can see he went from signing for making recommendations that the viceroy signs to then just making the recommendations and signing himself. And then eventually he just affixed a rubric, and we don't know who did the writing. It was all done behind closed doors. By the later part of the 18th century, most of the records related to the Juzgado show no clear signs that the viceroy or the asesor were present or even touched the paper with any ink at all. A great deal of the archive of the Juzgado de General de Naturales is described by Brian Owensby as over-processed in compared to the autos or individual papers that were drawn up for civil hearings. For example, many of the Juzgado's records from the 1770s contain executive rulings bearing the viceroy's name, but showing only the rubric of the chief notary of the governmental office, a man named Juan Martinez de Soria, who scratched out papers containing decisions in a bare office that was adorned by only one wood filing cabinet. At least a couple times in the 18th century, the Juzgado went so far as to explicitly forbid native subjects from appearing in person at the court. For example, it required the district magistrate or the alcalde to tell the natives of Tacuba not to bring gifts of fowl, meaning, kind of probably pigeon, to the court for Christmas, which must have been a common practice. And another went out to an opposing party that was indigenous in a suit from Ixtlahuaca to refrain from bringing sinister reports to the Juzgado. Now, this could be attempts to kind of keep influence and corruption away from the court. But I really see that there was a physical distancing, and you can really see that expand over the course of the 17th century. Indigenous litigants stay in place and send papers. The doormen of the court were charged with filtering out all but the court-appointed representatives of the petitioners, called solicitadores, right? They were named to the court. Indeed, the question of whether the doormen would receive a salary from the half-real levy on indigenous tributaries was an issue of ongoing controversy, highlighting how important their work was to dictating who could enter to file a petition in the halls of the palace. Solicitadores were agents of the Juzgado, so they were paid, and they worked on the clock, we know, by setting up their desks on the outside in the palace hallways, the corridors, between 8 and every day, and from lunch to the close of business day. There, they would take oral complaints, if necessary, of petitioners, or the pieces of paper that petitioners or their agents would bring with them, and turn these paper by their kind of formalizing magic into acceptable legal genres that were to be vetted in public audiences, let's say before the audiencia, or potentially for the viceroy's executive via or channel. Of course, the solicitadores could call on paid interpreters of the court who could work in indigenous languages. So I don't mean to argue that indigenous litigants were completely shut out of the court, and we can go to the next slide. A review of the series of Indios in the Archivo General de la Nación de México, which houses thousands of the Juzgado's records, demonstrates that sometimes the court did call for parties to appear in person at the palace. But the patterns are really intriguing. I looked at 150 calls for legal subjects to show up in person anywhere, to ocurrir or parecer in the court's jurisdiction. And the vast majority required that parties appear not really at the palace, but locally before secular or ecclesiastical officials. Sometimes parties were called to the capital city within a set number of days. So what do we do with those cases? Over the course of the 18th century, there were those calls. You have to come in 15 days to Mexico City to the palace. My sense is that most of those were for cases that were in the audiencia and not being handled by executive summary in amparo by the viceroy. If we look, though, over time, as I talked about, my partner in crime, Yana Yanakakis, has done this website that traces the apoderados, right? Those who got poderes from native communities in Oaxaca to send representatives to Mexico City to represent them. And what you can see is that they increased over the course of the 18th century to appear more frequently, shrinking the distance between the rural regions and the court, right? But what is important to remember here is that they were mediators. So petitioners themselves from the pueblos were not going. They were increasingly using these literate apoderados who had a kind of regular circuit going to Mexico City, representing probably dropping off the petitions that were already written in paper before the solicitador, right, who then took it, and all of this was being done without any personal contact between petitioner and judge. So regardless of whether it was like an agente or an apoderado from outside Mexico City, when they arrived, they most likely did all of their business here at the lower floor, which you can see in this floor plan, which was a very bustling urban space that did a brisk trade in official paper that bore either the royal seals or papal seals. And what I have here are circles showing all the places that almacenes de papel sellado, right? Or bulas. So they were selling this stuff right at the main floor of the palace to make sure that you could have your petitions on the appropriate paper. And unofficial rogue legal agents stepped over drunks who often were splayed out in, around the fountain in the center. Sometimes there were carriages that had been pulled up and just left over in this courtyard as well. So this was a kind of, messy urban space. And the agentes there might be hawking their literacy in the law, offering to craft petitions for individuals who were coming to figure out whether they had a case. A late colonial assessor to the Juzgado, Eusebio Ventura Beleña, he goes by Buenaventura as well, attempted to put an end to this infiltration of informal or vernacular petitions into the court in 1784. He insisted that the solicitadores kept regular hours and always wear their golillas, right? Their kind of ruffled collars to signal that they were bureaucrats, official bureaucrats, and to distinguish them from the agentes. And he gave his opinion that any indigenous litigant or petitioner who showed up at the palace with a document that had been written up outside should be questioned about the identity of the author, and the author then thrown in jail. This was a completely impotent move, right? There was no way he could do this because, the amount of construction or crafting of these kinds of cases and petitions and the intervention of rogue writers was too great to ever get a hold of. And in fact, there were rulings in Madrid that occurred 3 years later that involved both petitioners in Madrid for the Council of Indies, the Consejo de Indias, as well as a petition on the part of the procuradores of the Audiencia of Nueva España, of Mexico, in Nueva España, also that put before the crown this question of whether to accept petitions of agentes and whether litigants had the right to choose their own representatives. And the ruling was that litigants had that right. They could use any petition, any writer that they wanted to, as long as the person was not found to be corrupt in some way. And it was one of these many steps of kind of opening the channels of the court and really in some ways encouraging everyday litigation that was going on under Bourbon rule. So I'm going to kind of make a little turn for the time that we have just to talk a little bit about the physical space that the Juzgado occupied inside the palace. It's really, it's like a disappearing act, right? Because there are times when the sources seem to refer to it as if it's a fixed space, like a sala, right? Like a very formal courtroom. The solicitadores of the Juzgado were directed to set up tables in the corridors or the aisles right outside of the tribunal, right? The Juzgado also appears as a space, a real physical space, in the recounting of this 1692 riot by famed Baroque intellectual Carlos de Sigüenza y Góngora, who traced the spread of the fire that engulfed the palace through various places until it got to its vulnerable heart, which were the residences of the viceroy, the royal chapel inside, and what he called the Juzgado de Indios, which he located as facing south towards the like a plaza that was on the corner, on the kind of adjacent to the Zócalo. Yet, despite all these descriptions, and we can go to the next slide, these plans of the palace, and I kind of look through all of these, that designated all of these different spaces for legal affairs and jurisdictions. And not one of them is an office or a room designated for the juzgado itself. There are, this is the 1709, kind of plan to rebuild the palace after it had been half burned. And if you could go, Gustavo, to the next image, this is the key. It's a little unclear, but we can read through all of these key to see what's there and look at all of these different functions, right? We have things like antechambers for gentlemen, torture chambers, the sala and the scribal office for the merchants guild, offices for the juzgado de bienes de difuntos, right? Like very similar kinds of things. All of these had a specific place in the arched halls of the palace, but not the juzgado de naturales. It's possible that the viceroy sometimes met in a place called the sala de acuerdo, which was a tribunal close to his apartments. But what about all of these papers that were coming in? Do we really think that they were like taking place? And the other thing is that I just recently found a description from 1770 where this very kind of special, almost secret sala that the viceroy used only to meet with the most elevated, distinguished, prestigious guests was redesignated to actually become the Juzgado de Naturales, right? Obviously, it's homeless. There is no space for it, which basically what I'm trying to say means that the whole thing was kind of imaginary. It was, in fact, an exchange of papers. And so I'll kind of go to my conclusion, which is that I think that there was a kind of disembodiment and dislocation of physical or material encounters around the law inside the palace that connected the viceroy to indigenous petitions. And what this means, I think, is that we shouldn't think of these courts so much in material or personal terms, but in terms of the political imaginary, right? This hazy extra textual, right? Not written down and then made into the imagination. This life of the juzgado may not really be a distance or a barrier between the viceroy and indigenous petitioners, but rather a space for the production of the royal mystique that legitimized a colonial rule. Following scholars like Alejandro Osorio, we might conclude that much like the simulacra of kings that were paraded through colonial capital cities, the absences, as much as the pageantry of the juzgado, made it not unreal, but or even half real, but hyper real. But I have even further thoughts, right? So we imagine indigenous petitioners could have all kinds of imaginary interactions with the viceroy and with his authority because they never really got close enough to smell his stench or feel his heat, right? But I think there's another side of this too, and that's why I begin and end with the riot. The floor plans that I searched to pinpoint the physical space of the Juzgado General de Naturales were created in a very specific context. And Gustavo, if we could go to the next slide. So this is another plan to redesign after the fire. They were all meant to build up the palace after the riot of 1692. These plans were, planned to replace what had burned. All kind of reflected dreams of better fortifying the palace. In this one, there are tons of guardhouses, interior turrets, right? So that there would never be another attack. And they indicate that the response to the riot was to greet anyone who wanted to enter with arms rather than with an open door. And I want to, in that light, look again at the next slide, which is to go closer in the next slide to Villalpando's Vista del Zócalo de la Ciudad de México. But now from the vantage point, and if you'll click again, Gustavo, I think it'll bring us even closer. Let's see. There we go. So we can kind of look a little bit closer there and see kind of focus in on the burn part and the door. In the words of literary scholar Anna Moore, who is at the Universidade da Brasília, so I just wanted to point out that she works right there in Brazil. Villalpando's painting, like these blueprints for reconstruction, imagined an order that could develop in the shadow of the crumbling facade of viceregal governance. Among the idealized elements in this painting, I'd like to point out, is the size and presentation of the main door. This is not the size of the main door. So Villalpando has exaggerated the size of the main door. And this is obvious if we look at an image, and that's the next image, which is a more proportional image from the end of the 18th century. That's really, if you go to Mexico City, you can see that's what the doors actually really look like. So this door, Villalpando enlarged the door. Why? I think maybe to indicate that in a post-riot world, the king's colonial subjects still could find ample entry to the palace. Maybe he was trying to idealize that there was no blockage to get to the viceroy or to justice. Perhaps maximizing the door minimized how prominent a role the door itself and exclusion and inclusion from the palace had figured in the riot. So that's how I'll conclude. On the first day of unrest during the riot, a crowd had pushed into the palace courtyard, aiming to climb up the stairs towards the upper floor of the palace, where the tribunals and the viceregal residences were located. They were repelled. The next day, rioters, who were led by fierce stone-throwing women, no good riot every good riot is led by women, we know this. They come back to the plaza, and according to Sigüenza's account, it wasn't so much the scuffle in the patio that marked the turning point in which the crowd turned on the palace and colonial rule, but the moment, he says, when the principal door was shut in the face of the rioters. In fact, it's worthy of reflection that native petitioners who had come any time before this for their day in court at the Juzgado General de Naturales generally were not allowed to enter through this main door. They were sent through this side entrance up back stairs known as the escalera excusada, right? They had a special entryway. Was this perceived as special, like a nice special access, this back stairs, or was this perceived as a narrowed approach to the king's justice? A rioter in the Zocalo in June of 1692 gave his opinion. As the fire was tearing through the palace, each tribunal painstakingly enumerated by Sigüenza in his account of the fire, each representing a different jurisdiction or privilege in colonial law, the flames finally reached what Sigüenza called the Juzgado General de Naturales, engulfing it in smoke and threatening the flammable documents within. So really, this was just a storehouse of paper, which Sigüenza makes himself the hero of salvaging. And salvaging the archive of the Juzgado was tantamount to salvaging the sovereignty, right, of the Spanish. Beneath this fire on the streets, an official had confronted one of the rioters and asked what he was doing there. The rioter answered not with an indictment of the viceroy or even a cry about the price of maize. Rather, he responded, "I swear to Christ, those legal bureaucrats who do nothing but push paper and throw people in workhouses all day must die." So I'll conclude there and see what you guys think about the paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Bianca. Thank you so much. I mean, I was trying to stop the presentation. Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, it was a terrific talk, and I'm sure we have lots of questions and comments. I was so impressive for sure. I mean, there are many topics, but and with the use of the architecture to show the relevance, I mean, in the role of justice and how justice worked that time and in that context. And I mean, it is absolutely fantastic. I mean, things here we are going to be, I mean, an open debate. Those who want to ask something, I mean, feel free. As Bianca already told us, you can use both Portuguese or Spanish, and for sure English. If she had any, I mean, a difficulty, that if I may, so with some word I can help.
Thank you.
So feel free. I have many comments, but I prefer to to give the opportunity to our colleagues. So if anyone wanna start, feel free.
Y quisiera decir, si me quieren preguntar sobre otro trabajo, otros artículos, lo que sea, estoy abierta a todo.
While they are thinking, I think I'm gonna just comment a few things. This I mean, the connection between the Juzgado General and the vice king, it's something very interesting, and I mean, it's pretty connected to the medieval tradition of applying justice and doing justice, administering justice by the king himself. And I think it's something that it's sometimes hard to us in the Portuguese and Brazilian tradition to understand this thing, because in Brazil we didn't have someone with this kind of role until the end of the 18th century, and justice was I mean, not a centralized justice. And I mean, it's interesting because in the Spanish America, and particularly in the in Mexico and Peru, I guess, besides the vice king, the viceroy, there was also a court. And I was imagining how I mean, these relations between the Juzgado General and the Audiencia de Mexico, for example.
Yeah, I think so. First, I had a thought about halfway through this, just presenting right now, about a striking moment in that I read about in Kirsten Schultz's very wonderful book. I'm not sure how it was translated into Portuguese, but she wrote a really wonderful book. Tropico Versailles, it's called, and it was about the the period in the 19th century with the Braganzas in Rio, right? And there's a moment in that book where I believe enslaved people approach João, right? Like physically, and he administers justice, and his ministers say, "You shouldn't be doing this. This is not." I wish I could find it. I just was reminded of it, but I was thinking that, in a way, Brazil has this incredibly distant relationship for so long, in which it makes natural sense that the law and proximity to the king and to the crown in general is done textually, right? It's done through the communication that's taking place in writing, and that is as natural as can be when you have no viceroy, no king's living image until the end of the 18th century. But right as there's a proxy established, then you get the actual king himself who's walking the very streets, which is just inconceivable. And it really raises the question about whether that increases or decreases the overall legitimacy and power of justice, or the sense that people sense that they're actually receiving justice. And it's an important question too, because as I was working on this paper, I had a traffic ticket and I had to go to traffic court, some ordinary thing here in Miami, and the pandemic meant that I could do it remotely. And it was so much more efficient, and it was so much more pleasant, and it was so much better, and I was much less likely to be upset and feel that that I had been a victim of injustice because I didn't have to go. So, I was thinking about all these things too, because we now live in a very virtual world. We're meeting virtually, and yet we can feel really close to one another, right? And in some ways, it almost is better, right? You can fill in the rest of my house with your imagination. If you like me, you think that it's pleasing to you. If you didn't like my talk, you think it's probably messy, right? And, unpleasant. But, the way that our imagination fills in the rest is really part of what I was getting to. But you asked a very specific question, Gustavo, about the relationship between the viceroy and the audiencia. And it's interesting because I think that there are scholars who see them as far more cooperative than most of the literature has presented them. But my reading in general about the Juzgado is that it was to the extent that the audiencia and many of those who were roped into the Juzgado one way or another, procuradores or others, they weren't really remunerated, right? Once the taxes, the tribute was set, it remained, right? And so it really called on a lot of resources when the viceroy channeled the cases from the Juzgado into the audiencia. And at least my impression always of reading many different types of petitions and cases from ordinary people that reached the viceroy in Peru as well as in Mexico was that the audiencia was really a lot less interested in hearing those cases. It was not lucrative, right, for all of the functionaries, because those who worked on those were salaried. Just as one final thing, the viceroy did also kind of receive these petitions in Peru, and there was a jurisdiction that functioned similarly, but there was no Juzgado de Indios, right, or Juzgado de Naturales in Peru. This was it. There were two different organizational systems for receiving indigenous justice. And maybe learning from the overwhelming response of physical encounters in La Ciudad de Mexico, when this was established in Peru, everyone was supposed to stay in place, and there wasn't the kind of magnet to the palace established in Lima that there had been in Mexico City.
I don't know if our Peruvian colleague, Resonores, who is here, wants to add add something about the Peruvian experience.
I don't see Renzo.
Yeah, no, he's here. Hey. Sometimes the micro is not okay. But and then I was wondering also about. I think you have already told us, but I really didn't get it. About how many petitions are there more or less in the archive, and if someone have already thought about classifying, it's not classifying, but organizing this information in a territorial perspective. I mean, from where did these petitions came? Because when I think about a kind of court, it's not a court, but even a place where justice or administered, I always think about a kind of relation with the place where the officer was. And you told us, including about this kind of work Yana Cax is doing about mapping and looking particularly to Oaxaca. But I mean, do you have some information about it, about the territorial origins and the amount of petitions?
Right. So the amount was extraordinary, right? Like we're talking about hundreds of thousands, right, over time, because they could be, especially when we're talking about writs of amparo, right? those are relatively summary. They don't, from what I can ascertain, they don't involve legajos that are filled with autos that have, really large case files. And so I can kind of explain how I think that we get to the writ of amparo on the other side. But Brian Owensby has a really wonderful book that is focused around the juzgado. And he, in fact, did some looking to see which regions were contributing. And it's not completely as you might imagine, which is to say, there are, it is kind of concentric in that the closer you are to the Ciudad de Mexico, if it's an indigenous district and it's relatively close, you get the most. But places that are kind of have vibrant judicial lives, like Oaxaca, the Zapotec and Mixtec areas of Oaxaca, contribute a really surprising number, even though the distances and the geography is very prohibitive, right? It's a long way from Oaxaca to Mexico City, and it's often traversing really rugged land, right? But what's super interesting that Yana really shows us is that we can't assume, and Owensby here, I think, doesn't deal with the physicality or the materiality of the petition or whether people are coming. We know sometimes they did, or there might be a small delegation. But Yana really actually, by tracing the apoderados, shows us how, what the, puts a face to the petition and gives us a very clear idea that there were these specially designated people whose job it was to take the petitions. And this kind of means that the textual life of the court is expanding, right? And my sense is that the number of actual petitioners coming from far away is really actually quite small, and it's not as overwhelming. It's happening. They probably are even a feature of the Zócalo. One can imagine seeing indigenous people coming from different places around Mexico with their different traje, right? Probably was a normal feature of everyday life in the Zócalo, right? But that, they're not, that the number of people coming in person was just a fraction of the amount of paper that was arriving. One indigenous agente or apoderado probably brought several cases or several petitions at one time. And I don't believe that those were voluminous. Now, they could be voluminous in the sense that if they were about civil cases, as they often were, which were being handled by the alcalde mayor in a district, but the petition for amparo was just some feature of that case and probably was just written up as a single or a very short amount of documents, right? And that was what was brought to the palace, and that was what was ruled on and written out by the fiscal. The papers were signed and sealed, and they were sent back to the alcaldía, right? So it's very much an exchange of papers rather than of people.
And then I was wondering now also about this structure, if I may, so because when it's this Juzgado General, it's a little bit it seems a little bit like some kind of courts that I'm not classifying, but I see as a kind of personal courts, if I may. So just like, for example, in ecclesiastical jurisdiction, the auditores ecclesiásticos in the dioceses, the bishop was the judge,
yeah.
but actually, and then that's my question. In the case of this court, the bishop formally was the judge, but he actually didn't do this job.
Mhm.
This job was in charge of the general vicar, who was most of time he studied canon law. He studied canon law. They studied canon law. They have legal knowledge. And did you find any information about that? Because I suppose that the viceroy was assisted by someone in this activity. And did you find something?
Yes, absolutely. So this is the assessor, right? The asesor of the Juzgado, which was established by the Conde de Monterrey at the beginning of the 17th century, takes over, right? And that's not that unusual. The asesores are, advising many different kinds of judges, and we have them also appointed to some district magistrates who are not versed in the law, right? That's not that unusual. But the thing that's interesting about the asesor is that even he begins to disappear over the course of the 17th century. So soon he's not even signing the papers anymore. And it's really being handled by the scribal office, which physically, materially, really is just some guy who's working in a back room, a functionary. So we go from these very kind of elaborate pomp and circumstance meetings between indigenous caciques, right, and the first viceroy, Velasco, uno. This is obviously somewhat imaginary, but these kind of, ideas of receiving petitioners in person in the late 16th century. And by the time we get to the 18th century, it's almost like a rubber stamp kind of operation, a law factory, right? And I think that it's that transition that most interests me, right? I don't know that that means that there's less justice. It might mean that there's more access, but there's certainly less mystique, and there's less. I would argue that it might weaken the legitimacy, as the rioters indicated.
I don't want to monopolize have the monopoly. So if I mean, I still have many questions, but and I feel free. I think Sarah or maybe Delmiro, their cameras are on, so I suppose that they want to add something. You can do it either in English or Spanish or Portuguese. Feel free.
Ladies first, but I can do it first, maybe. Okay. Thanks so much for the lecture, Professor. I have two questions. I will try to make them in English, but if I have any trouble, Professor Gustavo would help me. First question is, for what I understood, the petitions was addressed to the viceroy, right? But what was the procedure after this? What the viceroy he judged the cases, or he was only a figurative role in the procedure? And the second question is that what was the matters discussed in the petitions? It was what the contents, and it was only civil, about family or freedom or something about like that. Thank you.
Great questions. So the interesting thing is that these petitions, or the kind of initiation, is always addressed to the viceroy. And what you find, what I was not able to see at any point is a indigenous, let's say a pueblo, that is acting collectively, going to the viceroy, or let me say it separately. They had access to the audiencia through other channels, but they would not be appealing to the Juzgado General de Naturales, right? If they were taking that channel. And I haven't made the count. I don't know for sure, but my impression is that most of the petitions were going to the Juzgado. They were taking place within that jurisdiction because it was favorable, and it tended to favor anyone who made the petition to the Juzgado. The Juzgado was established specifically for indigenous litigation, right? And it had to be conformed to, depending on who the parties were, right? And so 2 indigenous litigants, 2 communities, and those were the majority of the disputes. They would be between pueblos over lands, or there sometimes might be things that had to do with complaints about administration or corruption or tribute. But the vast majority were collective disputes between parties, occasionally, or not rarely, but occasionally individuals in certain disputes. The Juzgado had a separate arm that was criminal, and they did regular visits to the jail in Mexico City, and there's a whole separate criminal arm of this, which is really interesting, and they kind of maintained it, and this was to keep us, let's say, special, mostly lighter or punishments for indigenous subjects, because indigenous subjects were not to be punished as harshly as most Spaniards. Now, of course, we know a lot of what was happening was that the punishment was funneling them into labor in some way or another. But there were annual inspections that the assessor or the viceroy made of the royal jail for the criminal arm of this. I'm far more interested, of course, in the civil arm of it, because it's there that it was the most kind of hazy. And I'm really always interested in civil law. Civil law is far more boring than criminal law. But here's why we should study civil law. Civil law, for the most part, involves individuals who are appealing or acting in order to enact their vision of justice, right? They're not brought, in Spanish we say, de parte or de oficio, right? Civil law is almost exclusively de parte, right? So if you are looking for ordinary people's vision of the law, surely you can see it in criminal law, but it gets tangled up when you have the state prosecuting and secret denunciations, and it'll say, ha llegado a mi entendimiento, says the alcalde, que fulano de tal está amancebado con fulana de tal. Well, there is someone who's doing that, but they can hide in the criminal court, right? From denouncing their neighbors or otherwise. And of course, we know the state can be incredibly disciplinary and round people up on their own. In civil court, it's kind of free of that. People are generally voluntarily entering civil court in order to bring about some kind of just outcome. And for me, I think that makes it far more interesting, because if you want to know what people thought about the law, they're going to be freer to at least enact that through bringing cases that are in the civil sphere. So, and you did ask one other question about, that matters. I told you. It was like, it's almost, if you're talking about Mexico and you're talking about indigenous litigation, it's almost always over land. Like it's, that's a land and tribute.
Okay, thank you. Thank you,
Sure.
Professor.
Delmiro is a PhD candidate here at the university, and he studies criminal law. And I always say, man, it's always an opportunity to think about that. I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
But I understand the fascination of civil law, includes also in the law history, because it's an ordinary an unordinary person against another ordinary person. And so it might be more revealing about the litigations, about the problems, the social problems inside a community.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, obviously, it's it's a competition, and it's not a competition, but I do think obviously the criminal stuff is far more interesting. I'm not going to tell you that I always enjoy, a 400-page civil, it gets pretty boring, in there. But if you keep focused on what you're doing, you can make it through. Tara.
Hi, Professor Bianca. Thank you for your lecture. It still amazed me to put a face and a voice on the text I'm reading, so it's really nice to see you. I wanted to stay last because I think my question is kind of basic or silly, but the status of personas miserables is a ecclesiastical status, right? So it is afforded only to Christians, so only converted natives?
No, I mean, that's such a great question. Let me try to think about, because the conversion status is so much more, it's more meaningful in inquisitorial, right? And but not even in ecclesiastical courts, from what I've seen. If you have an apostate or someone who's not converted, they are still subject to civil law in the same way. So, and it is a civil. It comes from kind of medieval, but even before that. But it is a civil category, and the kind of rationale behind it is those who are left unprotected. To my mind, it's a function of a kind of patriarchal vision of society. Widows, orphans, the enslaved, and then eventually indigenous people, who are all thought to be vulnerable in some way. And the first book I wrote, I spent a lot of time really trying to explain how customarily, it's never written down in any kind of concrete way, but customarily indigenous people were considered menores, right? And the metaphors that drew them into this, miserable category were those of being orphans, right? As well as having the right to what was known as restitutio ad integrum. So these are the rights of those who are left vulnerable. They are imagined to not have a patriarchal male protector, and so their status in law is one of vulnerability. I hope that's. I've never seen anyone deny that status to any petitioner or even a criminal subject based on their religious or confessional status.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Professor Yami can.
No. You can go on, Sarah, and then you may.
All right. So just to see that I get this straight, so it was more common to use the word personas miserables as a legal category in inquisitorial processes, right?
No, in civil processes.
In civil processes.
Yeah, and inquisitorial processes, it was more important to ascertain. It really came down to race or caste, because indigenous people were not subject to the Inquisition, right? And so, that was the functional legal subject category. I have to say, I may be missing something. I have to think for just a second. But I've never seen jurisdiction in the everyday world that I'm talking about, right? I'm not dealing with ships of African captives, right? And debates between Portugal and Spain and, let's say, the Dutch over who has jurisdiction. Let's leave those aside. On the mainland, I have never seen the religious status of any subject determine whether or not they have access to the protections of personas miserables. It doesn't matter. But obviously, indigenous people were not subject to the Inquisition. They would be channeled and potentially into the Juzgado de Naturales in Mexico in its criminal function most of the time.
So, and even when they are not called personas miserables, they are also treated like in a patronized way.
Very, yeah, and that's super important too, because enslaved people were never given the status of menores or minoridad legal, but by the 18th century, they were represented by the defensor de menores. So it was a functional or customary kind of creep, let's call, like over time, you know, the idea that even enslaved people and indigenous people were the same as children before the law grows over time, right? So that it functionally is the same. The defensor de menores operates. I mean, obviously, this gets more complicated based on age, right? And criminal, but I've never ever seen those particular privileges withheld to be appointed a procurador, right? To have the case adjudicated or kind of by the defensor de menores, who served as an asesor, not as the judge. But that was given to any subject, right, who kind of fit the persona miserables, like that status, right? If they were enslaved,
without question if they were converted already or not.
No.
All right. So thank you very much, Professor.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Thank you, Sarah. Yome, please.
Hi. Thank you, Professor Bianca. It was a fantastic talk. And I wish we could have some of information you have to Juzgado to Portuguese America. But actually, I had some questions, but you have answered some of them. But I would like to know if you could describe some of other records or sources you have beside the petitions. And the second thing I would like to know, it was if it was possible to appeal the decisions of Juzgado, and if yes, but to what court?
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll start with that one. There's nowhere to go above the Viceroy except to the Consejo de Indias, right? And yes, it is true that rulings at the level of the Consejo de Indias were appealed to. I mean, at the Juzgado were appealed to the Consejo de Indias, right? But so many of the things that I'm focusing on in this executive vein, right, were these writs of amparo, which are so summary that they're not even really like appeals. They're not even like full cases. I mean, they're based on conflicts that might be full cases back in the pueblo, right? But what we can imagine the writs of amparo more are almost procedural motions to halt something or to get something. So let me give a concrete example. A writ of amparo will say, I won a lawsuit. This is just one example. And now the opposing party wants to appeal it. And I don't want this case to be appealed. I'm a miserable Indian, you know, and the case is settled and I want the opposing party to be in perpetual silence on the matter. And the Viceroy will allow that. And then you have the writ of amparo to kind of show that you've used your special privileges as an indigenous petitioner or litigant, and no further action. A lot of times the writs of amparo were to halt either someone moving onto your lands, collecting fees from you, or pursuing more litigation. The opposing party was never notified, right? And never had a chance to respond. It was in that manner an executive ruling, right? It wasn't the adjudication necessarily of two opposing sides. It may have technically been a matter of the Viceroy's function as providing justice, but he wasn't hearing, or his assessor weren't hearing both sides of a dispute. They were dispensing a privilege to the indigenous litigant based on the indigenous litigant's status. The litigant often was a whole pueblo acting for the República altogether, but nonetheless, it was a one-way privilege, right? Unilateral, ruling on a legal matter, usually halting further action. That's at least what I found, right? So it would normally be the opposing party who would then appeal to the Consejo de Indias, right? But that required a lot more resources. It's hard enough to get all the way to Mexico, get a petition all the way to Mexico City, but obviously people did it, right? So you could in fact move then, but there's really nowhere else to go after the viceroy, right? Lots of alcaldes mayores were very resentful of the kinds of rulings that would come down from Mexico City, right? Because they were detached from the two sides, and many times they constrained local judges and made them much more subject to viceregal power than they would have been without this huge channel set up for indigenous petitioners to go directly to the viceroy. Does that make some sense? So it's a very special summary kind of ruling, executive, meaning not the process of two opposing parties erring before the judge, but rather one party approaching and getting a privileged ruling that came from the viceroy, right? And that was the bulk of it. I think that there are far more of those than there were the viceroy saying this needs to be heard, both parties must be heard, and a case must proceed. Generally, if a case had to proceed, he would push it over to the audiencia, right? Who still technically were ruling in the Juzgado de Naturales. They had different rules for what they would do. It would be more summary. They had appointed solicitadores, but most were handled with this executive summary. The other sources that I looked at were obviously these reports, especially from the early viceroy to the crown, that set up the whole functioning of the Juzgado. Also, complaints and inspections, but complaints in the 18th century about this guy, Ventura, right? Belena, who was outraged at the chaos that the palace, of the functioning of the palace, and the access and the popular nature of everyday law taking place in this very venerated, hall of justice. You get those kinds of things, but you always have to be very careful because there were a lot of very exaggerated portraits of chaos and disorder from the end of the 18th century. Officials specialized in the art of drawing pictures of absolutely uncontrolled chaos in the colonies in order to enact some of the reforms that were pretty strict that they were seeking. And I definitely think that was the case with Belena's reports about the palace.
I don't know if anyone else has questions. I mean, feel free. I have two other questions, but I just wait if someone else wants to. Okay, I'm gonna I'm gonna ask my two questions. The first one is when I heard your talk today. And I was trying to make some connections to these two works I mentioned in the introduction of this talk, particularly the Enlightenment on Trial and this text you published with Yana Katz. And if I'm not wrong, this text has a difference in comparison with these two others. I mean, of course, it has many differences for sure, but two things appear to me as made me to pay attention for it. It's a first work of you that is trying to analyze or to understand something I could call an APRA jurisdiction. I mean, it's not because the Enlightenment on Trial is a book that is concerned about this ordinary jurisdiction in the villages and the pueblos, alcaldes mayores, and so on. And this text with Yanakakis is concerned about Indian jurisdiction in pueblos de indios y repúblicas de indios and so on. And then my question is, which connections you can you could observe when you connections and differences when you analyze this so different jurisdictions?
Yeah. Well, that's definitely true. I mean, I've always looked at the audiencias and the viceroys to generate, these kind of summary decisions all the time, especially about children, right? I mean, all of these miserables have access one way or another, but I have to say, I think what's interesting to me is that I feel that the documentation becomes vaguer and harder to read for just everyday experiences. Obviously, we, have lots of discussions of processions in major viceregal capitals, who goes before whom, and special attire, who wore what. But none, even apart from that, when we talk about the law and justice, I felt that my grasp, my actual ability to visualize what was happening grew weaker the higher the jurisdiction got. And so my attempt to understand what was happening in the Juzgado de Indios, right, as it was colloquially called, was really at first an attempt to inform myself. I knew that I had a better handle on how justice was happening in the pueblos, or even at the level of an alcalde mayor or a corregidor, or even an intendente, right, who sometimes moved around and, would go on these visits and get individuals kind of coming up to him. And I have a comment about bishops in just a second, but, I had such a better vision of that. And I thought, well, maybe it's because I don't know. So I started reading about the Juzgado de Naturales. The other thing that struck me is when I did research in Mexico City on the Juzgado as a special jurisdiction, I was very struck by, I looked from the 1660s to 1800, by how uniform the records were. They were just kind of kept in a big empastado, right? They were in cuero. They were like in a hardback book, and it was just uniform handwriting, one after the other after the other. And I could even imagine the pieces of paper that were being given, sealed to the petitioners to take back. And I have evidence of viceregal rulings being brandished in communities by litigants, right, who had the piece of paper, and they were very valuable. I also want to say I have a wonderful case. I wrote with Ana Moore, who's in Brasilia, about a woman named Tomasa Maldonado, who was from Peru, who lied to her husband about what the viceregal ruling had said, and nobody could check what she was saying because everyone in the village, no one could read. So she would come with, people would take these pieces of paper and they could say they said anything, right? They had the seal, they had the writing, but not everyone in the villages could read what was on them. And she was, I'm presuming functioning in Quechua because of where she was, right? But she told her husband that he was going to be arrested and that this ruling said all these things. And it didn't say any of those things. It was actually not as favorable to her as she was saying. But anyway, you can see the artifacts of the pieces, the rulings, the writs of amparo that are ending up back in the communities. But then there was these record books, and they were just one after the other of uniform handwriting. These are incredibly different then the autos that are collected, even including when you get to the Consejo de Indias, right, where they're out of sequence, there's a million different handwritings, they move through time. There are these huge collections of various legal actions. In the Juzgado de Indios, by the time you get to the 18th century in Mexico City, it's a factory. It's just one after the other after the other. These are not textual artifacts, collections of different moments in time that are being touched by people. They're actually quite distant from that. And that was really intriguing to me.
Wow, wow, fantastic. And then I have my last question. I don't know if anyone else has questions, but my last question is not actually it's not a question, but it's I'm asking a suggestion. Because one of the most important things I got from the Enlightenment on trial was to think about the role of the litigants. Procuradores y abogados and so on. It's in Brazilian case, we can affirm that without with any doubts, with no doubt. There's not a study on the litigants. I mean, nobody studied the role of procuradores, advogados, and so on, advogados provisionados, and so on. Do you have any suggestion to, I mean, to in the way to find these actors? How could we I mean, identify them? It's very hard because in many times they sign. There are in some cases also procurações, for estabelecendo, giving powers to someone giving power to the lawyer and the litigant. And sometimes very hard to identify the firm. So
yeah,
I
who's
mean,
doing it, right? And a lot of times so here's my question I'll kind of ask for you. And it is simply whether or not you have here's what I found. When you really look closely at civil litigation, of any nature, but especially at the lower jurisdictions, what you find are that the earlier the papers are in the suit, meaning chronologically, not always how they're filed, they are written with no indication of who is doing the writing. There's no procurador who's identified, and they're written in the first person. And then once a case is accepted, right, a lugar, right, and it's accepted, then we get the appointment of procuradores and abogados, and then we have them signing in their own names, right? In my methodological attention, focused, I looked at the whole case and the legal arguments, right? All of those were very important to make the case about the Enlightenment. But I was very, very focused on the earliest petitions, because those were being written up by anonymous agents in what Renzo calls these polyphonic or these delegated writing situations. And I found over and over again that it was the early petitions that were the closest to the litigants' first impulses about what they would find in law. I think there's so much more for us to do with the fact that so much of the cases were written in the first person and the writers were not identified. These are cultures in which not being able to read or write did not preclude, did not prevent people from assuming that they had legal agency and that they were full legal subjects. I think the first, looking at whether or not the petition you're looking at or the part of the suit is in the first person, or is written in the third person by an identified agent is key, because then you can see the different papers coming together to create the autos are not all the same. The first ones that are written in the first person often are being written up outside of the court by these agents, writers for hires, or friends who are acquaintances who are literate in the law. And that is a whole underworld to the law that we need to bring forward. And I think it gets us away from imagining the law is always imposed on people, right? And we see it practiced by ordinary people more.
Thank you so much, Bianca. Thank you so much. I think we want to thank you once again for being here. I mean, it was a fantastic afternoon for us. We learned a lot. It's as Sarah a very interesting said. It's very good to us as a group to have a voice for the text for your text. It's a privilege.
It's a privilege for me to put a face to anyone who's reading anything I wrote. So thank you so much, Gustavo. Obrigada.
We finish here the talk. It was very important to us. It was a very important year also, because we tried to have every month a guest, and the only month we didn't have was October, but we hope that next year we can go on with the seminar, probably in this remote way. I mean, it's easier because we have here guests from many parts of the world. I mean, there are people from here in Fortaleza, but EMA, I guess, is in Maceió, for example. Felipe Garcia was here. He was in Lisbon. And Nuno Camarinhas is in Trinidad and Tobago, and Renzo is in Lima, I guess. So it's a seminar that people just come and they normally stay and come back. I hope that you had a nice time here with us. Ok. Bom, ela saiu, eu acho. Mas é isso. Então é isso, pessoal. A gente encerra aqui. Acho que ela, sem querer, desligou.
Deve ter caído, mano. Coisa assim. Olha, caiu.
Okay, she's back.
It's okay. I came back right to the end. I look forward to coming back as a visitor, okay?
Thank you very much, Bianca.
Thanks, Gustavo. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, professor.
Bye.
E a todos, a gente espera que no próximo ano a gente continue, né, com o seminário. Essa foi a última atividade, né, do NEDAP este ano. A gente mudou bastante o formato, né, enfim, né, por virtude de uma série de questões. A gente espera que no ano que vem a gente retome as atividades presenciais, enfim, né, as reuniões e discussões de textos. Mas a ideia é manter o seminário em modo remoto. Assim a gente pode continuar recebendo convidados, enfim, né, que nos dá um enorme prazer receber, né, como aqui neste momento estão o Nuno e o Renzo. Então é isso, pessoal. Muito obrigado mais uma vez e Feliz Natal para todos, Feliz Ano Novo e
Feliz Natal, Gustavo.
A gente se vê.
Feliz Natal a todos também.